Look at this photograph. It was taken in the 1860s in one of America's greatest cities. Notice anything strange? The streets are perfectly paved. The architecture is magnificent. The buildings stand in flawless condition. But something is terribly, deeply wrong with this image. There are no people, not just a few people, almost none at all. The squares that should be bustling with merchants and carriages stand silent and empty. And here's the detail that makes your skin crawl. Look at those hundreds of chimneys rising from every rooftop. In an era when fire was the only source of heat and the only way to cook food, when every home needed a burning hearth to survive, not a single wisp of smoke rises from any of them. Not one. The city is not sleeping. It is frozen in an unnatural, impossible stillness. Now, you might think this is simply a limitation of early photography. Long exposure times couldn't capture moving people, right? That's the standard explanation. But let's test that theory. If people were there but simply moving too fast for the camera, we should still see their stationary traces. Where are the vendor stalls that would have stood in place for hours? Where are the horses tied to posts, patiently waiting while their owners conducted business? Where are the stacks of firewood piled against walls, the sacks of coal waiting to be unloaded, the carts parked at designated stands? All of these things were motionless elements of daily city life. A long exposure would have captured them perfectly. But they're not there. The absence of people is just the beginning. What's far more frightening is the absence of life itself, the complete and total lack of any evidence that these cities were inhabited at all. This isn't just one photograph from one city. This is a pattern that repeats across dozens of major urban centers throughout the world. St. Petersburg, Paris, Moscow, New York, all captured in the same eerie state. Magnificent architecture standing in perfect condition, waiting, empty, silent, dead. The official story tells us these were simply new photographs of established cities, documented for posterity. But if you look closer, if you stop accepting the comfortable explanations and start asking uncomfortable questions, a completely different and far more disturbing picture begins to emerge. Because these empty cities hide a secret that begins not with what we can see on the surface, but with what lies buried beneath our feet. And when we dig into that mystery, we find something that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the 19th century and the very foundations of our civilization. Let's travel to Seattle, a major port city on the Pacific coast of the United States. Old photographs from the late 1800s show us something that seems to belong more in a fever dream than in documented history. Imagine a city street lined with solid, well-constructed buildings. Now imagine that next to these buildings, right in the middle of an urban landscape, rise giant cliffs of earth. These aren't gentle hills. They are nearly vertical walls of compacted soil, some of them as tall as the buildings themselves. Their flat tops suggest this was once a uniform ground level, and somehow the city has been partially excavated from underneath it. In some photographs, entire houses stand on top of these earthen mounds, perched precariously, as if they might topple into the chasm below at any moment. Other buildings sit at the base of these cliffs, looking like archaeological artifacts that have just been unearthed. The impression is inescapable. The city was buried. And then someone, using enormous effort and resources, dug it back out. But Seattle is just the beginning. Travel to Kansas City, located in the very heart of the American continent, thousands of miles from any ocean, sitting at an elevation of nearly 900 feet above sea level. Here we find photographs that are even more shocking and few. Their implications. One image captures a massive stone building buried in soil right up to its roof. Only the upper portion of the structure is visible. Everything else, windows, doors, entire floors, is hidden under an incredible thickness of earth. This isn't a building with a hill in front of it. This is a building buried inside a hill. Another photograph from Kansas City, dated 1867, allows us to appreciate the scale in numbers. It shows the corner of a large stone building covered on its side by soil to the height of 2 full floors with high ceilings. That's approximately 4 times the height of a person. About 23 feet of dense clay and earth. 23 feet. That's not a gradual accumulation of dust and debris over centuries. That's a sudden, massive burial event. And here we encounter the first serious problem with the official explanation. We're told this is simply the result of street regrading, improvement projects to level the terrain and make the cities more functional. Seattle's engineers supposedly took advantage of a great fire to remove the glacial hills that hindered development. Kansas City removed clay banks to pave streets. These are the stories presented to us. But can routine engineering work explain a building buried up to its roof? Can street leveling account for 23 feet of soil covering major structures? The scale of what we see in these photographs goes far beyond any municipal improvement project. It looks less like careful urban planning and more like the aftermath of something catastrophic. To understand what really happened, we need to see how they removed this earth. Because the excavation process, captured in photographs from the same era, is no less impressive than the burial itself. What we see is nothing short of an industrial war against the soil. Steam shovels, massive iron monsters hissing with steam and clanking metal, were brought in on temporary railway tracks laid right through the city streets. Picture this scene. In the middle of a city, rails and ties stretch between existing buildings. On them sits a huge excavator, scoop by scoop, biting into the multi-yard thick layer of earth, loading it into train wagons waiting immediately alongside. Entire convoys worked like a giant conveyor belt, hauling soil out of the excavated zones in a continuous stream. But alongside these understandable, if impressive methods, the photographs show something far stranger. In image after image, we see people spraying tall vertical walls of soil with what look like giant fire hoses, powerful jets of water. The official caption reads, "regrading the streets." But this method makes no logical sense. Turning tons of earth into liquid slurry is extraordinarily inefficient. Mud complicates the movement of machinery, creates chaos, requires additional effort for collection and removal. If this were ordinary soil, why would you intentionally make your work harder by soaking it? Unless it wasn't ordinary soil at all. Unless there was something about this earth that required water specifically. Something that would explain why the same technique used in Seattle appears in photographs from the Alaskan gold rush. There, miners faced a substance called muck, a frozen mass of soil, ice, peat, and organic debris. To get through this permafrost to reach gold-bearing layers below, they used hydraulic monitors, powerful water jets under immense pressure. Water didn't just wash the frozen ground away, it thawed it, turning rock-hard permafrost into liquid slurry that could be directed into channels and sluices. Now look again at the photographs from Seattle. The method is identical. Powerful streams of water directed at walls of earth, turning them into flowing mud. If Seattle was using the exact same specialized, labor-intensive technique as Alaskan gold miners used on permafrost, the logical conclusion is unavoidable. They were dealing with the same material. And here we find a curious detail in the historical records. The hills that were so methodically washed away and removed from Seattle are officially called glacial hills. At first, this seems like just a geological term, describing ancient terrain formed during the last ice age. But what if we're meant to take these words literally? What if relatively recently, perhaps only 150 to 200 years ago, the Pacific coast was struck by a colossal ice tsunami? Not a wave of water, but a moving wall of ice fragments, mud, silt from the ocean floor, and pulverized debris. This monstrous surge swept across the land, burying everything in its path. And then, due to the enormous volume of ice in its composition, this slurry froze, forming what would later be labeled glacial hills. Not true geological permafrost formed over millennia, but flash-frozen catastrophe debris. This hypothesis explains everything simultaneously. The massive volume of soil that suddenly appeared, the strange method of removal using water, which was essentially a thawing process, the need to dump all this material into the sea rather than simply redistributing it. Building on such unstable thawing ground was impossible, so it had to be washed away and disposed of. But here this elegant theory hits a wall called geography. Because it explains Seattle perfectly, but it is absolutely helpless before the mystery of Kansas City. Kansas City is a fortress against any conceivable water-based catastrophe. It sits in the heart of the continent at nearly 900 feet elevation. No tsunami, no matter how unimaginable, could reach it. The physics simply don't work. Yet buildings there were buried to the same depth, if not deeper. This means a different force was at work in Kansas, a different element entirely. And old photographs give us the clue. Early images of Kansas City show a strange, undulating landscape, almost like frozen waves of sand or underwater dunes. The terrain doesn't look like it was covered by wet mud or waterborne silt. It looks like it was buried under something loose and dry. And there's another telling detail: the almost complete absence of mature trees in these early photos, only a few young saplings. This suggests that not long before, perhaps 50 years prior to the photograph, this was a practically barren landscape. These observations point to a completely different catastrophe. What if the central regions of the continent fell victim not to water, but to air? What if these lands were hit by dust storms of apocalyptic, unimaginable force? History records the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, when massive storms carried away topsoil from the fields of entire American states. But what if in the past, an event occurred that far surpassed even that in power and scale? A series of catastrophic storms lasting years or decades, methodically burying everything in their path. This theory perfectly explains the key feature that didn't fit the tsunami hypothesis: the preservation of the buildings. A giant wave of water carrying ice and debris possesses colossal destructive kinetic energy. It wouldn't have just buried cities, it would have obliterated them. But a sandstorm acts differently. It doesn't strike, it engulfs. Billions of grains of sand driven by wind slowly but relentlessly accumulate against walls, burying streets, windows, doors, gradually interring a city without destroying its structure. The buildings survived precisely because there was no impact force. They were simply encased in a sandy tomb. So, now we have a troubling picture: coastal cities buried under ice and mud, interior cities buried under dust and sand. Two different elements, two different mechanisms, but the same result: entire urban centers entombed and then painstakingly excavated. This can no longer be dismissed as coincidence or routine construction work. We are looking at evidence of multiple simultaneous catastrophes affecting different regions of the planet in different ways. The question becomes unavoidable: what kind of global event could have triggered such a chain reaction? What force could have caused oceans to overflow their shores in frozen waves while simultaneously stripping topsoil from continents and throwing it into the air? What could change the climate so radically and so quickly? But the buried cities are only half the mystery. Because after these metropolises were excavated, after the enormous effort to make them habitable again, they still sat empty. The photographs prove it. Perfect infrastructure, no inhabitants. Which brings us to the second great anomaly of the 19th century and G's. Anomaly that seems completely unrelated until you see how perfectly it fits together with the empty cities. We're talking about the sudden, inexplicable appearance of millions upon millions of orphans. In the 19th century, orphanages, foundling homes, and charitable institutions began springing up across the entire planet at an unprecedented rate. The scale is staggering. According to official records, some institutions took in 4,500 infants, and that was just one facility. A partial list from public sources names more than 64 large orphanages founded in Great Britain alone during this period. And even that list is far from complete. Similar patterns appear in France, Russia, America, Australia. Everywhere, suddenly, an endless wave of children without parents. The numbers were so vast that researchers still cannot determine accurate figures. Official history tries to explain this with wars, disease, the hardships of industrialization. But do the numbers actually support these explanations? Wars leave orphans, certainly. But wars are localized. This was a global phenomenon lasting decades. Epidemics killed many, but could they create such a specific demographic imbalance, leaving behind millions of healthy children with no adults to care for them? And here the two mysteries, empty cities and endless orphans, begin to merge into a single disturbing picture. What if this flood of orphans wasn't the problem, but the solution? What if these children were the human resource needed to repopulate emptied territories and cities across the globe? The thought is monstrous, but it connects the unexplained emptiness with the unexplained abundance of young lives in a logical chain. Consider the timing. The photographs of empty cities date from the 1850s through 1870s. The explosion of orphanages and foundling homes occurs in the same period. And then there's the orphan trains. In the United States alone, more than 200,000 children were transported from East Timor, coast cities, and distributed to farms and towns in the Midwest and West. Officially, this was humanitarian work, finding homes for the destitute, but the scale suggests something else. A deliberate, organized program to settle empty territories. The evidence becomes even more disturbing when you look at how this process was normalized and even commodified. At the turn of the 20th century, a man named Martin Cooney organized traveling exhibitions across America. His main attraction? Premature babies. In amusement parks and World's Fairs, amidst carnival rides and vendor stalls, he set up fully functioning intensive care units. Visitors could pay a small fee to enter pavilions where tiny, barely viable infants lay in rows of glass incubators. The atmosphere was surreal. Spectators gazed at these babies as they would any other fair attraction, while nurses in crisp uniforms cared for the children as part of the show. Life-saving procedures turned into profitable entertainment. But here's the sinister detail. At many fairs where Cooney exhibited these infants, there were simultaneous expositions dedicated to eugenics, the pseudoscience of selective breeding to improve the human race, the ideology that would underpin the darkest chapters of 20th century history peacefully coexisted with a pavilion full of saved yet imperfect children. The question becomes unavoidable. Why were these exhibits so popular? Did people of that time not have children of their own? Was the sight of an infant such a novelty, and where did such massive numbers of premature babies come from? Cooney claimed to have saved 80,000 infants. 80,000. Where would you even find that many premature births whose parents were willing to hand them over to a showman? Was this truly about saving lives, or was society being conditioned to see children as objects that could be displayed, evaluated, and perhaps acquired? While America was transfixed by baby exhibitions, Europe had developed a more direct method. It was hidden in plain sight, disguised as the most innocent and common item of the era: the postcard. In the early 20th century, a massive series of postcards appeared, numbering in the thousands, all dedicated to babies. But these weren't typical sentimental portraits. They depicted surreal, sometimes disturbing scenes. Children emerging from cabbage patches, hatching from eggs, growing on mushrooms, floating in shells on water. Infants being transported by airship, by train, delivered by storks as if they were cargo. When you search for information about this phenomenon, you're met with near total silence. There are no official catalogs, no serious academic studies. It's as if this entire genre of visual culture has been deliberately forgotten. The only mention appears in an obscure book, noting that little is known about these cards, but acknowledging their influence on surrealist artists, including Salvador Dali himself. But these postcards weren't art. They were something else entirely. Pay attention to the inscriptions. Although most are in French, examples exist with American postage stamps, German text, Dutch captions. This was an international, perhaps global phenomenon. And the captions, which at first seem part of surreal design, form a single shocking system when you examine them closely. The key is a simple phrase that repeats with frightening regularity, the French expression à vendre, for sale. This isn't a hint, not an allegory, not a joke. It's a direct, unambiguous commercial announcement. One card depicts a fairground scene under a sign reading "Modern Baby Bazaar." Below are the terms: free entry, we fear no competition, everything is for sale, and the final chilling line, we do not accept returns. On another card showing babies among cabbages, an invitation reads, choose, the little ones have just grown. The word grown is more suited to describing a harvest than human beings, but the height of commercial cynicism appears on cards where each child has what amounts to a product description. Infants sit in baskets, each with a caption: I will be good, I won't wet the bed, I am cheerful, I will love you, I am cute. This is nothing less than an advertisement aimed at potential buyers, describing the features and qualities of the merchandise. Many of the children in these images look unhappy. Some are crying, clearly frightened. There are cards showing children locked in cages like animals for sale. The caption on one leaves no room for interpretation. Children for sale, do you want a baby? Suddenly, the fairy tales we tell children take on new meaning. You were found in a cabbage patch. A stork brought you. These aren't just innocent fibs. In the context of these postcards, where children are literally shown growing in fields and being delivered by stork couriers wearing postman caps and carrying scales, these phrases become descriptions of an actual system. a system for the cultivation and distribution of a new population. The storks in these images often wear uniforms and carry postman bags. They're part of a logistics network alongside trains, automobiles, airships, all depicted as methods of transporting groups of infants to different regions. And then there's that word that appears on multiple cards. Repopulation, not childcare, not adoption, repopulation, the deliberate settling of territories. Now let's connect all the pieces. Magnificent cities sitting empty, despite perfect infrastructure. A global network of orphanages housing millions of children of unknown origin. A commercial system, documented in thousands of postcards, openly advertising these children for sale with no returns accepted. A massive transportation program, the Orphan trains, moving over 200,000 children to settle empty territories in America alone. And baby exhibitions conditioning the public to see infants as spectacle, as objects. All of this happening in the same narrow window of time, the mid to late 19th century. This is not a series of coincidences. This is a coordinated operation. A program to repopulate emptied cities with a new generation that has no memory of what came before. Children who could be told any story about the past because they had no parents or grandparents to contradict the narrative. But this raises the ultimate question. Repopulation after what? What event could have emptied these cities in the first place? What catastrophe would require such a massive global response? The buried buildings tell us something sudden and violent occurred. The empty cities tell us the population disappeared. The orphan phenomenon tells us a new population was systematically introduced. But none of this tells us the cause. None of it explains what actually happened. And this is where mathematics enters the investigation to deliver a blow that shatters the entire official timeline of human history. Let's conduct a simple experiment using only official data. Population growth statistics that are publicly available and accepted by mainstream academia. Take England, for example. Since the beginning of the 19th century, its population has grown from about 9 million to over 65 million people. Spain has seen its population increase by nearly 20 million in just the last 70 years. These are documented, verified numbers. Now we're going to use these same growth rates to perform a reverse calculation, not into the future, but into the past. If populations grow at a certain rate going forward, they must shrink at that same rate going backward. It's simple mathematics. Let's see what the world population should have been in those dark ages when the great cathedrals were supposedly being built. We begin our countdown. Applying the recorded rate of population change in reverse, the numbers start to shrink dramatically. Rewind just 100 years from today to the early 20th century, and we're already well below current figures. But that's expected. Keep going. By 1886, according to these calculations, the entire planet would have had only about 928 million people. By 1817, just over 200 years ago, that figure drops to 314 million, already several times less than official sources claim. But we continue. By 1748, only 106 million people remain on Earth. That's the population of modern Japan spread across all continents. Now let's take a truly massive step backward, the year 1610. When we're told the great geographical discoveries were in full swing, empires were being built, large-scale wars were being fought. According to our mathematical model, based on official growth rates, the world population at that time would have been just 11.8 million people. That's fewer than live in Moscow alone today. But we're not stopping there, because we started this investigation with a question about cathedrals. So let's go all the way back to the era when these architectural marvels were supposedly being erected. The 1200s, the age of Gothic construction. Continuing our calculations with the same relentless logic, we arrive at a result that is not just surprising, but absolutely impossible to reconcile with official history. At the very moment when, according to historians, thousands upon thousands of people across Europe were enthusiastically building stone masterpieces that required incredible organization, logistics, and specialized knowledge, the entire population of planet Earth would have been approximately 18,700 people. Let me repeat that number, 18,700 people on the entire planet. That is the population of a small town or a modern apartment complex. And we are told that during this time, hundreds of architectural marvels were being erected simultaneously around the world. Massive cathedrals requiring millions of tons of precisely cut stone. Castles with walls so thick and engineering so sophisticated that we struggle to replicate them today. All supposedly built by a global population that could barely fill a sports stadium. Who quarried and transported millions of tons of stone? Who developed the complex architectural plans? Who fed these builders? Where did the specialized knowledge of mathematics, engineering, and material science come from? Mathematics provides a clear, undeniable answer. It's impossible. The historical version, which claims that a virtually non-existent population was more technologically advanced in construction than we are today, collapses entirely under the pressure of simple arithmetic. And if we continue the calculation even further back, the results become even more absurd. By the year 600 AD, the population of the entire planet Earth, according to these official demographic models, would have been 3 people. 3. This is not hyperbole. It is the direct and inevitable result of calculations based on the very numbers that historians themselves provide. We have reached a mathematical dead end, a 0 point beyond which the official narrative cannot exist. And this leaves us with only 2 possibilities. Either human history as we know it is completely fabricated, with all of ancient civilization being invented fiction, or something happened, something recent. Something that almost completely reset the human population and forced history to be rewritten. The math doesn't lie, but its result is absurd, which means our initial assumption must be wrong. We've been assuming that human history is a continuous, unbroken process of growth. But what if it's not? What if in the very recent past, there was a catastrophic break in this timeline? What if the mathematical model breaks down because it's trying to look beyond the event horizon of a reset, into a world that existed before everything changed? This is where mathematics, photographs, and buried buildings all converge on a single, unavoidable conclusion. Something happened. Something global. Something that depopulated the planet and buried entire cities. Something so catastrophic that it required a coordinated worldwide effort to repopulate and rebuild. And something so sensitive that the truth about it had to be hidden, rewritten, and buried as deeply as those cities. But if the physical evidence has been covered up, if the photographic record shows only the aftermath, if the mathematical proof reveals only that something is wrong, where can we find actual testimony about what occurred? Where can we find witnesses who saw it happen and tried to tell us? The answer is the last place the censors thought to look. Because you can burn documents, you can edit photographs, you can rewrite textbooks, but it's much harder to erase every copy of a famous poem or pull every edition of a beloved novel from circulation. Literature, especially classical literature that has been widely published and memorized, is remarkably difficult to completely suppress. And this is where the architects of the cover-up made their mistake. They focused on obvious records, on histories and scientific journals and official accounts. They didn't think that some of the greatest writers of the 19th century would hide the truth in plain sight, coded into their works as metaphor and allegory. Or perhaps they noticed, but by then it was too late. The works were too famous, too widely distributed to suppress without drawing attention. So, they did the next best thing. They taught us to read these works as fiction, as artistic expression, as anything other than what they actually were: eyewitness testimony. Ivan Turgenev's novel, Home of the Gentry, contains a scene that seems unremarkable at first. The protagonist, Lavretsky, is 45 years old. He returns to his family estate, weary and disillusioned. Sitting in a garden, he reflects on his life and addresses the younger generation. The speech seems like typical nostalgia from an aging man, but read his actual words carefully. He says, "You will not have to seek your path as we did, to struggle, to fall and rise amidst the darkness. We scrambled just to survive, and how many of us did not survive? Literary scholars have trained us to see this as metaphor. The darkness of ignorance, political oppression, spiritual anguish. But what if Turgenev meant exactly what he wrote? What if the darkness was literal? The novel takes place in 1842. Lavretsky is 45 years old, meaning he was born in 1797. His formative years, age 14 to 16, would have fallen between 1811 and 1813. It was during this period, Turgenev tells us, that this generation had to rise amidst the darkness, scrambling just to survive, not to find their place in society, not to achieve spiritual enlightenment, to survive. And many didn't. The phrasing describes mass death. Turgenev leaves only a hint, the restrained memory of a survivor. But another writer described what was happening with far more explicit detail. Nekrasov wrote a poem titled The Grief of Old Naum in 1874. If Turgenev hints at consequences, Nekrasov transports us to the epicenter of the catastrophe. He writes, "The sun forgot to shine, the clear moon went out, and it was hard to distinguish the stormy day from the night." This is not poetic embellishment. These are the exact conditions that would result from what modern science calls volcanic winter or nuclear winter. When massive amounts of particulate matter enter the stratosphere, they form a dense veil blocking solar radiation. Day becomes indistinguishable from night. The sun and moon don't just dim, they disappear entirely. But Nekrasov doesn't stop there. He adds, "Thunder rumbled incessantly, and the whirlwind was terrible, and man stood beneath it, frightened and voiceless. Continuous thunder, destructive winds. These are symptoms of massive atmospheric disruption. Shock waves, pressure changes, the kind of phenomena that accompany planetary-scale catastrophes." The poet describes humans as voiceless, paralyzed by the magnitude of forces beyond comprehension. He mentions that before these events there was an easy time, but then everything changed instantly. After a long period of gloom, the dawn lit the edge of the sky, but immediately a new storm replaced the old. Multiple waves, multiple phases. This wasn't a single event, but a cascading series of catastrophes that ultimately destroyed the former way of life. Official history acknowledges part of this. It admits that the early 19th century experienced severe climate anomalies. There's even a scientific term for it, the year without a summer. The accepted explanation is the eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia in April 1815. The volcano ejected an estimated 180 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere. The energy released is calculated at 800 megatons of TNT equivalent. That's 800 nuclear warheads of 1 megaton each, or 400 bombs of 2 megatons, detonating simultaneously. The sulfur compounds reached the stratosphere, where they formed sulfuric acid, creating a reflective barrier that lowered global temperatures. The result was crop failures, famine, and disease. Europe saw outbreaks of typhus. A new strain of cholera emerged in Bengal. The math is impressive. The volcano was real. But does a single eruption on a distant Indonesian island really explain everything? Does it explain the descriptions in Russian literature of phenomena that sound nothing like volcanic ash dispersal and everything like technological catastrophe or weapons deployment? Mikhail Saltykov-Shchedrin, the great satirist, wrote something in his novel, The History of a Town, that reads less like satire and more like documentary horror. He describes how the northern horizon darkened and was covered with clouds. Something rushed rapidly toward the city. Not ordinary rain, not a typical tornado. An unknown force moved, literally boring into the earth, rumbling, humming, emitting unnatural hollow croaking sounds. Such behavior is characteristic of dense particle clouds or ground-hugging, shock waves. But here's the crucial detail. Although it was not yet close, the air in the city began to vibrate. The bells and towers began to ring by themselves. Trees bristled. This describes a pressure wave or seismic precursor, infrasound preceding the visible arrival of catastrophe. Animals went mad in the fields, finding no escape. The earth shook. The sun dimmed. People were seized by indescribable primal terror. The phrase, "it came," sounds like a sentence. This is not political allegory. This is a chronicle of an event that made the ground shake and the sky turn black in the middle of day. And again, official records support the physical reality of what literature describes. Historical archives document actual earthquakes in the central Russian plain during this period, a region that is geologically stable. Earthquakes there are anomalies. A historical review of Tula Province, published in Ulm 1850, records that on October 14, 1802, perceptible earthquakes occurred from underground forces. Buildings swayed, dishes fell from tables. In Kaluga and nearby towns, church bells began ringing by themselves without bell ringers. On January 11, 1838, a similar phenomenon recurred. Earth tremors lasting about a minute. Both times, the vibrations moved from south to north. What causes seismic activity in a geologically quiet zone? Typically, such effects occur during powerful explosions or impacts from large celestial bodies. Shock waves radiating outward for hundreds of kilometers. Mikhail Zagoskin, in his novel about 1812, has his characters recall that it was not for nothing that last year an unseen star moved in the heavens for so long. This mention of a comet or bolide is followed by grim consequences. Not for nothing did cities, villages, and forests burn, and in many places the earth burned out. Not just forest fires, places where the earth burned out, destruction of the soil layer itself, transformation of fertile land into lifeless wasteland. Zagoskin emphasizes this happened before the war, before any invasion, meaning the great conflict that followed could have been merely a consequence of the cataclysm. Burning cities and scorched territories became the backdrop for subsequent historical events. And what about Russia's greatest poet, Alexander Pushkin, who lived through this era, who breathed this air and saw these landscapes? Could he have remained silent? Of course not. But his works have been so heavily edited, so thoroughly sanitized, that we have to read between the lines. Consider the famous introduction to Ruslan and Ludmila. Everyone knows the image, a green oak by the curved seashore, a golden chain upon that oak. We're taught to see this as fairy tale imagery, but apply technical thinking. What is a green oak? In nature, oak bark is brown, oak leaves are green, but if we're talking about a structure, green is the characteristic color of oxidized copper, a copper pillar or tower covered with patina. The golden chain? Gold is one of the best electrical conductors. The description becomes a copper core wrapped in conductive gold wire, a technical device, not a tree. The learned cat walking on the chain could represent a mechanism or carriage moving along this conductor. And Luca Morier itself, the location of this mysterious oak, appears on ancient maps. Now it's a wasteland, as if catastrophe struck a developed center and wiped it clean. Pushkin's 1820 poem mentions seeing Asia's barren limits, the scorched valleys of the Caucasus. Why scorched? This isn't summer heat. The word implies open fire or tremendous temperatures that turned flourishing land into ash. Documentary evidence of destruction on a scale that crossed borders. But far from all of Pushkin's words have reached us intact. His works underwent harsh censorship and posthumous editing. A striking example is The Bronze Horseman. Rare editions from the mid-1800s contain notes in ink, stating that significant portions were composed or rewritten by Vasily Zhukovsky, Pushkin's mentor and friend who also acted as censor. The textbook lines we memorize by heart are sanitized edits designed to hide the original meaning. If Zhukovsky rewrote entire passages, what was he trying to conceal? Perhaps the original text contained descriptions of the St. Petersburg flood or the state of the country after catastrophe that were too frank for official history. Even the name of Russia's great enemy in 1812 may be encoded testimony. Napoleon Bonaparte. The name is familiar to everyone, but few consider its components. Apollo is the god of light, patron of the sun. The prefix "na" or "ne" indicates negation. Napoleon becomes not sun, or absence of sun. His invasion becomes an allegorical description of darkness descending. The War of 1812 in literature may describe not a military conflict between nations, but humanity's struggle against advancing cold and gloom. Na Apollo, not sun, came to the lands, and with him, light vanished. This explains the famous frosts that destroyed the Grand Army. Perhaps the cold wasn't a tactical ally. It was the very essence of the cataclysm itself. Pushkin describes the enemy army as rabble, a strange word for a military force known for discipline and uniforms. Rabble paints a picture of a mob, desperate refugees. If a global climate catastrophe caused famine and devastation in Europe, then the so-called invasion becomes a desperate migration, a movement of massive populations fleeing devastated Western territories, searching for food and habitable lands in the East. They came not to conquer, but to survive. The burning cities contemporaries wrote about could have resulted not from scorched earth tactics, but from those fiery phenomena, those falling objects that preceded the migration. Europeans, facing years without summer and crop failures, moved toward where they believed life still persisted. History remembers this as war, but perhaps it was the agony of a civilization trying to save itself from climate collapse. And this testimony, this chronicle hidden in metaphor and allegory, was not limited to Russian writers. George, Byron in England wrote his poem Darkness in 1816. I had a dream which was not all a dream. The bright sun was extinguished, and the stars did wander darkling in the eternal space, rayless and pathless, and the icy earth swung blind and blackening in the moonless air. This is the same event Nekrasov described, the same darkness Turgenev referenced, the same catastrophe that buried cities and erased populations. Byron continues, morn came and came and brought no day. Fires were lit, forests burned, cities were consumed. Men forgot their passions in the dread of desolation, famine and despair. Byron describes humanity reduced to its basest instincts, fighting for survival in a world where the sun has disappeared. These are not independent fantasies from isolated writers prone to melancholy. These are consistent witness statements from across the globe. Russian novelists and poets, English romantics, all describing the same phenomenon in the same time period. We're not looking at scattered metaphors. We're looking at a coordinated body of testimony about a planetary event, an event that, in its physical characteristics and consequences, matches exactly what modern science would call nuclear winter or volcanic winter, atmospheric particulate blocking sunlight, rapid cooling, agricultural collapse, mass migration, societal breakdown. Official historical science acknowledges only a fraction of this, calling it the year without a summer and attributing everything to the Tambora eruption. We're told about epidemics and crop failures, but the causes of those scorched valleys, those destroyed cities, that great war which looked more like chaotic movement of desperate peoples across a cooling earth, these are carefully omitted from textbooks. The most striking aspect of this investigation isn't the catastrophe itself. It's the total oblivion to which it was consigned, an event that redrew the map of the world, claimed millions of lives, and required complete repopulation of major cities has been wiped from official academic history. Only encrypted lines in poems, censored memoirs, and architectural ruins remain. The impression is inescapable that 19th century history was deliberately rewritten to create an illusion of continuous, prosperous development when in reality it was a period of desperate recovery from near extinction. Here we arrive at the central question. Why classify these events? If this was a natural disaster, why hide its scale? Why go to such extraordinary lengths to bury the truth? Why repopulate cities with orphans who have no memory of what came before? Why rewrite literature, edit poems, censor novels? Why create an entire false narrative of steady progress and elegant balls when the reality was darkness, starvation, and the desperate struggle to rebuild? Unless the cause wasn't natural at all, unless this was something that couldn't be explained without revealing truths far more disturbing than a volcanic eruption. The buried cities prove something sudden occurred. The empty photographs prove populations disappeared. The orphan phenomenon proves a new population was systematically introduced. The mathematical impossibility of the official timeline proves history was rewritten. And the literary testimony proves witnesses tried to tell us what happened despite censorship. All the pieces converge, multiple forms of evidence, from different sources, using different methods, all pointing to the same conclusion. In the early 19th century, human civilization experienced a reset event, something that nearly wiped us out and forced those who survived to start over. The truth was too dangerous, too destabilizing, too revealing of uncomfortable realities. So it was buried, literally buried under 23 feet of earth in some photos, and figuratively buried under layers of false narrative, edited texts, and official explanations that don't withstand scrutiny. The convergence of mathematics, photographs, physical structures, and literary testimony creates a case that cannot be easily dismissed. Each form of evidence reinforces the others. The math proves official histories is impossible. The photos prove cities were empty, then repopulated. The buried buildings prove catastrophe. And the literature proves witnesses saw it all and tried to tell us. We cannot ignore this convergence. We cannot dismiss it as coincidence or collective delusion. Too many independent threads weave together into the same pattern. Something happened, something global, something recent, something hidden. And the more you look, the more evidence you find. Not in conspiracy theories or fringe sources, but in official photographs, published literature, documented mathematics, and physical structures you can visit today. The truth has been hiding in plain sight all along. We just forgot how to see it. We forgot how to read the testimony of those who tried to warn us. We forgot how to question the comfortable lies. We've been told about steady progress and unbroken history. But the evidence remains, waiting for anyone willing to look with clear eyes and ask uncomfortable questions. The investigation has only begun.